In the damp, overcast corridors of the Pacific Northwest during the winter of 1980 to 1981, Interstate 5 ceased to be merely a highway. It became a corridor of dread. Stretching from the urban sprawl of Portland through the quiet towns of Salem, Albany, and Kaiser, then north into Washington's Skagit Valley, this vital artery pulsed with commerce and daily life. Yet beneath its surface rhythm of truckers, commuters, and late-night travelers, a predator operated with unnerving calm. He was not a phantom of folklore, nor a drifter preying on hitchhikers, but a man who walked into brightly lit convenience stores and gas stations under the pretense of routine transactions. His victims were young women, clerks, cashiers, employees working solitary shifts in the stillness between midnight and dawn. The attacks followed a grim pattern: a demand for money, the cold press of a gun, then violence that often escalated to sexual assault or murder. Law enforcement agencies across multiple counties struggled to connect the dots. Jurisdictional lines blurred evidence, and the sheer ordinariness of the crime scenes masked the hand of a serial offender. Fear spread not through headlines alone, but through whispered warnings among co-workers, tightened security protocols at small businesses, and the unspoken anxiety of families whose daughters worked the night shift. At the center of this unfolding terror stood Randall Woodfield, a name that carried no immediate infamy, yet one that would soon be tethered to one of the most methodical and geographically concentrated violent sprees in modern American history. Once a promising athlete drafted by the Green Bay Packers in 1974, Woodfield had been dismissed before the regular season began, his potential eclipsed by troubling behavior that foreshadowed a far darker trajectory. Returning to Oregon, he drifted through low-wage jobs while cultivating a secret life of escalating criminality. By late 1980, that life had turned lethal. The highway he traveled, the same I-5 used by thousands each day, became his operational theater, its exits marking the locations of trauma rather than convenience. Survivors described a man of average build, calm demeanor, and unsettling control, traits that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background until it was too late. It was this very normalcy that made him so dangerous. He did not look like a monster because, in the eyes of society, he once looked like a success. The tension along the corridor mounted with each new report, each missing person bulletin, each silent store left ransacked in the early morning hours. Communities that prided themselves on neighborly trust now locked doors earlier and questioned every stranger. This was not a story born of rumor or exaggeration, but of forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and a trail of violence that would ultimately lead investigators to a single chilling conclusion. A former football player had become a relentless predator, and the open road he once drove for opportunity had become the stage for his reign of terror. The narrative that follows traces that descent, not as myth but as documented fact, through arrest, conviction, and a legacy that lingers long after the last siren faded into the Oregon rain. To understand the gravity of what unfolded along Interstate 5 between late 1980 and early 1981, one must first grasp the world through which Randall Woodfield moved, a region defined by its quiet rhythms, economic modesty, and geographic isolation. The Pacific Northwest of that era was not the tech-driven corridor it would later become. It was a landscape shaped by timber, agriculture, and small-town commerce, where communities often operated with a sense of self-reliance and mutual trust. Cities like Portland served as urban anchors, but much of the I-5 corridor wound through towns where everyone knew their neighbors, where a late-night shift at the local Texaco or 76 station was a common job for students or young adults trying to make ends meet. These service stops, often the only sources of light and activity for miles, were lifelines for long-haul truckers and weary travelers, but they were also points of profound vulnerability. Employees worked alone, sometimes for 8-hour stretches, with little more than a wall-mounted phone and a bell above the door for protection. It was within this ordinary, unguarded reality that Woodfield found his opportunity. Born in 1950 in Salem, Oregon, he had grown up in a middle-class environment and excelled early as an athlete. At North Salem High School, he stood out for his size, speed, and aggression on the football field, traits that earned him a scholarship to play at Willamette University, a small liberal arts college in the same city. There, his physical prowess continued to impress, and by 1974, his performance caught the attention of NFL scouts. He was selected in the 17th round of the draft by the Green Bay Packers, a moment that seemed to promise upward mobility and public recognition. Yet his time in professional football lasted barely a month. Coaches and teammates noted erratic behavior, including inappropriate sexual comments and actions that violated team norms. Rather than confront deeper issues, the organization simply released him, a decision that reflected the era's limited understanding of behavioral red flags in athletes. Back in Oregon, Woodfield drifted. He held a series of short-term jobs: bartender, laborer, security guard, but none provided stability or purpose. What remained consistent was a pattern of low-level criminality, petty thefts, indecent exposure, and sexual assaults that were reported but rarely prosecuted with severity. Law enforcement files from Marion County and surrounding jurisdictions contain multiple entries detailing complaints against him throughout the late 1970s, yet without a violent felony conviction, he remained free to move, work, and plan. By 1980, something shifted. The opportunistic groping and harassment gave way to armed robbery, then to acts of escalating brutality. His method was clinical. He would enter a business just before closing or during the graveyard shift, present a handgun, demand cash, and then isolate the employee. In many cases, the robbery was merely a prelude. Survivors later recounted how he maintained eerie composure, speaking in a calm voice even as he committed unspeakable acts. The geography of his crimes was no accident. He lived in the heart of the I-5 corridor, in Salem, and used the highway not just as a route but as a hunting grid. From Portland to Vancouver, Washington, and north to Bellingham, he exploited the very infrastructure that connected communities to sever lives. Police departments in Multnomah County, Clark County, and Marion County each investigated separate incidents: robberies, sexual assaults, disappearances, but the lack of a centralized database for violent crimes, combined with jurisdictional silos, prevented them from seeing the full picture. Families of victims were left in agonizing uncertainty, while the public grew increasingly uneasy, sensing a pattern but unable to name its source. Newspapers began publishing warnings about a man in a dark coat targeting night workers, but without a suspect, fear festered in the absence of answers. This was the setting: a region unprepared for a predator of such calculated cruelty, a law enforcement system ill-equipped for cross-border coordination, and a society that still believed violence of this scale belonged to distant cities, not its own rain-drenched highways. Into this landscape stepped a man who looked nothing like the monsters of popular imagination. No wild eyes, no tattered clothes, just an ordinary man with a past that included cheers from crowds and a future that would be spent behind bars. The stage was not set by drama but by routine: the hum of a refrigerator in a gas station, the flicker of fluorescent lights, the sound of tires on wet pavement. And in that mundane theater, Randall Woodfield began to write a story of terror that would be measured not in speculation, but in court transcripts, autopsy reports, and the silenced voices of at least 18 women whose lives ended far too soon. Randall Woodfield's path to infamy did not begin in shadowed alleys or prison yards. It began under stadium lights, on manicured fields where discipline, teamwork, and controlled aggression were celebrated as virtues. His early life in Salem, Oregon, offered few outward signs of the darkness that would later define him. Raised in a stable household, he was a physically imposing teenager whose athletic gifts set him apart from his peers. At North Salem High School, he played both football and basketball, but it was on the gridiron where his combination of size, speed, and raw power drew the most attention. Coaches saw potential, recruiters saw a prospect. By the time he enrolled at Willamette University, a small NCAA Division III school just blocks from his childhood home, Woodfield had already internalized the identity of an athlete. Someone admired, someone granted leeway, someone whose transgressions might be overlooked for the sake of performance. And for a time that bargain held. On the field he was a force. Playing tight end and linebacker, he dominated games with a ferocity that bordered on recklessness, earning All-American honors in 1973 and leading Willamette to one of its most successful seasons in decades. Off the field, however, a different pattern emerged, one that university officials and teammates noted but rarely confronted with seriousness. Reports of inappropriate sexual comments, unwanted advances toward female students, and incidents of public indecency circulated quietly, often dismissed as boys will be boys behavior or the excesses of a star athlete under pressure. The culture of the era, particularly in collegiate sports, tended to shield promising players from full accountability, especially when their talents brought prestige to the institution. This dynamic reached its apex in 1974, when Woodfield's name appeared on the NFL draft board. Selected in the 17th round by the Green Bay Packers, he was invited to training camp, a dream realized for countless young men across America. Yet within weeks, that dream unraveled. Packers coaches and staff quickly grew concerned. During practices, Woodfield exhibited poor discipline and difficulty following instructions. More alarmingly, multiple women associated with the team, including administrative staff and the wives of other players, reported unsettling encounters. Lewd remarks, lingering stares, and attempts at physical contact that crossed clear boundaries. Team psychologists flagged behavioral issues, and after a formal complaint was filed, the organization made a swift decision. Woodfield was cut before the preseason even ended, not for lack of physical ability, but for conduct deemed incompatible with the standards of the league. To the outside world, his release was framed as a routine roster move, a common fate for late-round picks. But for Woodfield, it was a profound rupture. The identity that had sustained him, the athlete, the achiever, the man with a future, was stripped away almost overnight. He returned to Salem not as a local hero who had tested the professional ranks, but as a man without direction, his sense of self now untethered from the only structure that had ever validated him. In the years that followed, he drifted through a series of low-wage jobs, each tenure shorter than the last. He worked as a bartender at a Salem nightclub, where patrons later recalled his volatile temper and inappropriate interactions with female customers. He took a position as a security guard, a role that granted him a veneer of authority he seemed eager to exploit. Throughout this period, law enforcement records began to accumulate. In 1975, he was arrested for indecent exposure. In 1977, he faced charges for attempted sodomy after assaulting a woman in a parking lot. The case was dismissed when the victim declined to testify, a common outcome in sexual assault cases of that era. In 1979, he was charged with burglary and sexual abuse following a home invasion in Portland. Again, the charges were reduced to misdemeanor trespassing after a plea deal. Each encounter with the justice system resulted in minimal consequences: fines, probation, short jail stints, reinforcing a dangerous belief that he could act with impunity. The conflict deepened not through a single catastrophic event, but through a slow erosion of restraint. The rejection from professional football had wounded his ego, but the repeated failures of the legal system to hold him accountable nurtured a growing sense of entitlement and invincibility. By 1980, the line between fantasy and action had blurred. What had once been opportunistic harassment evolved into premeditated violence. He began carrying a handgun, not for protection, but as a tool of domination. He studied routines: when stores closed, which clerks worked alone, which exits offered quick escape routes. The highway, once a symbol of connection, became his operational map. The fall from football star was not merely a career setback. It was the collapse of a fragile persona that had barely contained his predatory impulses. Without the structure of sport, without the scrutiny of coaches or the expectations of fans, those impulses found new expression. In robbery, in sexual violence, and ultimately, in murder. The genesis of his criminal spree was not born of sudden madness, but of a long-simmering resentment, a distorted worldview, and a system that repeatedly failed to intervene before tragedy struck. His story serves as a grim case study in how early warning signs, when ignored or minimized, can culminate in catastrophe, not because evil arrived suddenly, but because it was allowed to grow unchecked in plain sight. Between October 1980 and March 1981, Randall Woodfield executed a campaign of violence that was as methodical as it was brutal, transforming the I-5 corridor into a landscape of fear through a series of increasingly audacious attacks. His spree did not begin with murder. It began with robbery, specifically, armed robberies targeting small businesses where a single employee worked during late night or early morning hours. These initial crimes served both as a means of financial gain and as rehearsals for darker acts to come. He would enter a gas station or convenience store, often wearing a dark coat and baseball cap, present a handgun, demand cash from the register, and depart quickly. In several of these early incidents, however, he lingered just long enough to make lewd comments or force the clerk into a back room, hinting at motives beyond theft. By November 1980, the pattern escalated. In Portland, he robbed a 76 station and sexually assaulted the female attendant at gunpoint. Days later, in Salem, he repeated the act at another service station, this time binding the victim with duct tape before assaulting her. Survivors described a man who spoke calmly, almost conversationally, even while committing violent acts, a demeanor that unnerved more than overt aggression ever could. Law enforcement agencies across Oregon began to note similarities in suspect descriptions, modus operandi, and timing, but without a centralized database or formal task force, coordination remained fragmented. Then, on January 12, 1981, the spree turned lethal. Sherry Ayers, a 20-year-old woman living alone in a Portland apartment, was found strangled in her bedroom. There were signs of forced entry and sexual assault. Though initially treated as an isolated homicide, investigators soon discovered that Ayers had recently worked at a convenience store along I-5, one that matched Woodfield's known hunting grounds. Just over a week later, on January 24, 23-year-old Julie Wrights vanished from her shift at a Circle K store in Woodland, Washington, near the Oregon border. Her car remained in the parking lot, the register emptied, and no witnesses came forward. Weeks later, her body was discovered in a remote area of Cowlitz County, showing evidence of strangulation and sexual violence. These two murders, occurring in different states, under different jurisdictions, finally triggered a reluctant collaboration between Oregon and Washington authorities. Detectives began comparing notes and realized they were likely dealing with a single offender operating across state lines. Yet even as they pieced together the emerging profile, Woodfield continued his rampage. On February 3rd, he entered a U.S. bank branch in Keizer, Oregon, during its opening hour. Darlene Johnson, a bank teller, was alone when he arrived. He demanded money, then shot her point-blank in the chest before fleeing with a small amount of cash. Miraculously, Johnson survived. Bleeding and in shock, she managed to activate the silent alarm and provide a detailed description of her attacker. His height, build, clothing, and notably, a distinctive scar near his eye. This testimony became the first concrete break in the case. Within days, composite sketches circulated widely in local media, and tips began flooding in. Among them was a call from a former acquaintance who recognized the sketch as Randall Woodfield. Investigators pulled his file and found a chilling alignment. His residence in Salem placed him within minutes of multiple crime scenes. His criminal history included sexual offenses matching the MO, and his employment history showed he had worked at businesses similar to those targeted. Surveillance was initiated immediately. On March 7, 1981, after purchasing ammunition at a Salem sporting goods store, a move that confirmed his access to firearms, Woodfield was arrested without incident. The subsequent search of his apartment yielded damning evidence. A handgun matching ballistics from the Keizer Bank shooting, stolen property from multiple robberies, and personal items belonging to victims, including a watch traced to Julie Wrights. In total, authorities would link him to at least 18 violent sexual assaults and 18 murders across Oregon and Washington, though the true number may never be known. His victims were not random strangers encountered on the road. They were working women, students, mothers, daughters, performing routine jobs in places society deemed safe. The escalation of his crimes followed a clear trajectory, from harassment to robbery, from robbery to sexual assault, and finally to murder. Each act emboldened him. Each escape reinforced his belief in his own invincibility. The terror he inflicted was not merely physical, it was psychological, eroding the sense of security in communities that had long prided themselves on their quiet safety. Businesses installed panic buttons, hired overnight security, and discouraged solo shifts. Women altered their routines, avoided certain exits, and carried personal alarms. The open highway, once a symbol of freedom, now carried an undercurrent of dread. And all of it, the fear, the trauma, the loss, stemmed from the calculated actions of one man who moved through the daylight world unnoticed, his violence confined to the hidden hours when the rest of the region slept. The arrest of Randall Woodfield on March 7, 1981, outside a Salem sporting goods store marked not a sudden end to terror, but the beginning of a meticulous legal process designed to ensure that the weight of his crimes would be met with irrefutable accountability. Detectives from the Keizer Police Department, now working in close coordination with the Oregon State Police and the FBI, executed the apprehension with precision, aware that any procedural misstep could jeopardize the fragile web of evidence they had spent weeks assembling. Woodfield offered no resistance. He was calm, almost detached, as officers placed him in handcuffs and transported him to the Marion County Jail. Within hours, search warrants were served on his Salem apartment, yielding a trove of incriminating material. A .38 caliber revolver matching ballistics from the Keizer Bank shooting, stacks of stolen cash, credit cards belonging to robbery victims, and personal effects, including a distinctive watch later identified as belonging to Julie Wrights, whose body had been found weeks earlier in Washington. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten list recovered from his nightstand, containing names, addresses, and shift times of female employees at various gas stations and convenience stores along I-5, a chilling testament to premeditation. Over the following weeks, investigators connected him to at least 44 separate incidents spanning Oregon and Washington, including 18 sexual assaults and 18 murders, though prosecutors ultimately focused on the strongest, most forensically supported cases for trial. Charged with aggravated murder, attempted murder, sodomy, robbery, and kidnapping, Woodfield stood accused of crimes so numerous and geographically dispersed that they required unprecedented interagency cooperation. His defense team, led by public defenders due to his lack of financial resources, initially sought to challenge the admissibility of evidence and question the reliability of eyewitness identifications. Yet the cornerstone of the prosecution's case remained unshakable: Darlene Johnson's identification, corroborated by forensic ballistics, stolen property recovered from his residence, and a pattern of behavior so consistent across jurisdictions that coincidence became implausible. The trial began in Marion County Circuit Court in late 1981, drawing intense media attention and public scrutiny. Survivors took the stand one by one, recounting encounters marked by the same calm menace, the same methodical control, the same scar near the left eye. Forensic experts detailed how fibers from Woodfield's clothing matched those found on victims, how tire tracks near crime scenes aligned with his vehicle, and how handwriting analysis linked him to notes left at some locations. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Woodfield's legal strategy shifted toward mitigation rather than denial. His attorneys introduced testimony about his troubled post-NFL life, his history of minor offenses that had gone unpunished, and psychological evaluations suggesting antisocial personality disorder, but stopped short of an insanity plea, recognizing its futility. In November 1981, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all counts related to the murder of Sherry Ayers and the attempted murder and sexual assault of Darlene Johnson. The judge, citing the extreme cruelty, depravity, and predatory nature of the crimes, sentenced Woodfield to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Ayers' murder, plus an additional 90 years for the Kaiser Bank attack. Though he was never formally tried for the majority of the other killings, due to jurisdictional complexities, evidentiary challenges, and the practical limits of the justice system, the conviction on these two cases ensured he would never walk free. He was transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, where he remains incarcerated to this day, one of the state's longest-serving inmates. Over the decades, he has filed multiple appeals, all denied. Investigators and prosecutors have since stated that while the full scope of his violence may never be legally adjudicated, the pattern is clear. Woodfield operated as a serial predator who exploited systemic gaps in law enforcement communication and societal assumptions about safety. His capture did not erase the trauma inflicted on survivors or the grief of families who lost loved ones, but it did bring a measure of closure, an acknowledgement that the man behind the mask of normalcy had been seen, named, and contained. The resolution was not triumphant, but sobering. A reminder that justice, when it arrives, often comes too late for the victims, yet remains essential for the living. In the quiet corridors of the penitentiary, far from the rain-slicked exits of Interstate 5, Randall Woodfield lives out the consequences of choices made in the shadows of a highway that once carried his crimes, and now carries only memory. The imprisonment of Randall Woodfield in 1981 did not mark an end so much as a pivot, a shift from active terror to enduring reckoning. While he was physically removed from society, the consequences of his actions continued to ripple outward across families, institutions, and the cultural landscape of the Pacific Northwest for decades. Legally, his conviction set a precedent for how Oregon would handle complex, multi-jurisdictional violent crime. Prior to the I-5 spree, communication between county sheriff's offices, city police departments, and state agencies was often informal and reactive. In the wake of the investigation, law enforcement leaders acknowledged that earlier coordination might have prevented several deaths. This realization catalyzed the formation of more robust regional task forces and the adoption of shared databases for tracking sexual predators and violent offenders, changes that would later inform Oregon's participation in national systems like the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP. Though Woodfield was only tried for 2 murders, investigators in Washington and Oregon quietly closed dozens of cold cases by linking them to him through modus operandi, forensic re-examinations, and circumstantial alignment. To this day, some families receive letters from detectives stating that their loved one's unsolved homicide is attributable to Woodfield, based on investigative consensus, even if formal charges were never filed, a bittersweet form of closure that acknowledges truth without the catharsis of trial. For survivors, the aftermath was deeply personal and uneven. Some rebuilt their lives in privacy, choosing silence as a shield against re-traumatization. Others became advocates, speaking at safety workshops for retail workers or supporting legislation to improve protections for employees working alone. Darlene Johnson, whose testimony proved pivotal, largely retreated from public view but remained in contact with prosecutors, occasionally offering quiet encouragement to other victims preparing to testify. The psychological toll on first responders and detectives also lingered. Many involved in the case later described it as the most haunting of their careers, not because of gore but because of the sheer ordinariness of the settings where violence struck. Socially, the spree altered everyday behavior along the I-5 corridor in ways both visible and subtle. Gas stations installed bullet-resistant glass, panic buttons, and 2 employee policies during late hours. Convenience store chains revised hiring practices to include background checks that specifically screened for prior sexual offenses. Parents warned daughters about working overnight shifts in isolated locations, a caution that reflected both protective instinct and the uncomfortable truth that danger could wear a familiar face. Over time, Woodfield's name faded from daily conversation, but the unease he seeded endured in local memory, resurfacing each time a new serial predator emerged elsewhere in the country. Academically, his case became a subject of study in criminology programs, particularly regarding the transitional offender, someone who escalates from non-violent sexual misconduct to lethal violence when unchecked by consequences. Researchers noted how his early brushes with the justice system resulted in minimal intervention, reinforcing a cycle of impunity that ultimately cost lives. This pattern informed later reforms in how Oregon handles misdemeanor sexual offenses, emphasizing risk assessment and monitoring over dismissal or leniency. In popular culture, Woodfield was dubbed the I-5 killer by media outlets, a label that stuck despite his own rejection of it, and inspired books, documentaries, and true crime podcasts. Yet unlike more mythologized serial killers, he never achieved cult notoriety. His crimes were too geographically contained, his persona too unremarkable, his capture too swift for legend to take root. That relative obscurity may be a quiet victory. The focus remained on victims, not the villain. Today, Woodfield resides in the intensive management unit of the Oregon State Penitentiary, now in his mid-70s, serving a sentence that ensures he will die behind bars. He has filed numerous appeals, all denied, and occasionally grants interviews to journalists, though his accounts are widely regarded as self-serving and inconsistent with evidence. Meanwhile, memorials to his victims remain modest. A bench in Portland dedicated to Sherry Ayers, a scholarship in Julie Wright's name at a community college in Washington, candlelight vigils held by survivor networks on the anniversaries of their losses. These acts of remembrance carry no grandeur, only dignity. The legacy of the I-5 spree is not one of infamy, but of institutional learning and human resilience. It reminds communities that safety is not passive. It requires vigilance, communication, and the willingness to believe survivors before tragedy demands it. And it stands as a permanent record of what happens when warning signs are ignored, systems fail to connect, and ordinary spaces become hunting grounds. The highway still runs north and south, carrying travelers unaware of the history beneath its asphalt. But for those who lived through that winter of fear, and for those who inherited its lessons, the road serves as both a passage and a memorial, silent, enduring, and instructive. The story of Randall Woodfield is not merely a chronicle of one man's descent into violence. It is a mirror held up to systems, communities, and assumptions that allowed such a spree to unfold with devastating efficiency. His crimes exposed critical gaps in law enforcement coordination across jurisdictions, the dangers of dismissing early behavioral red flags, especially in individuals granted social privilege like athletes, and the vulnerability of workers in isolated, low-security environments. In the decades since his conviction, many of those gaps have narrowed. Regional task forces now routinely share data on violent offenders, convenience stores and banks have adopted enhanced security protocols, and awareness of predatory patterns has grown among both employers and the public. Yet the echoes of that winter along I-5 remain. Survivors continue to carry the weight of their encounters. Families still mourn daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cut short. The true measure of this history lies not in the notoriety of the perpetrator, but in how society chooses to remember the victims and apply the lessons learned. For viewers and readers engaging with this account, the call is not for fear, but for vigilance. Vigilance in recognizing warning signs, supporting survivors without judgment, and demanding institutional accountability when systems fail. It also lies in honoring the quiet courage of individuals like Darlene Johnson, whose clarity in crisis helped halt a predator who had operated in plain sight for too long. True crime, at its most responsible, does not glorify violence but seeks to understand its roots so they may be prevented in the future. If this story has unsettled you, let that discomfort become action. Advocate for better workplace safety standards, support organizations that assist survivors of sexual violence, and encourage open dialogue about consent, boundaries, and justice. The highway no longer trembles under the shadow of the I-5 killer, but the responsibility to protect the vulnerable endures. Remember the names, not just the crimes. Listen to the survivors, not just the headlines. And above all, recognize that safety is never guaranteed by silence, but built through awareness, empathy, and collective resolve. The road continues. What we do with what we've learned determines whether history remains a warning or repeats itself.